Imagine a place where the map has vast, empty spaces. Not the mythical kind marked with warnings of dragons, but modern streets without names. Where street signs are stripped clean, their metal surfaces erased. That's what happened in Millbrook, a town that some records claim never existed. My name is Daniel Harper, and this is a story that began with a strange find in my grandmother's attic and ended with me standing on the edge of a town, determined to erase itself from history. It all started 3 months ago. My grandmother passed away, leaving me her house in Massachusetts, a Victorian behemoth, brimming with 87 years of accumulated possessions. I'd been postponing the overwhelming task of sorting through it all, but with property taxes piling up, I had no choice but to take a leave from work and head north. The attic was the final frontier. Dust motes swirled in the faint light, filtering through a single dormer window as I sorted through trunks of old clothes boxes of holiday decorations and piles of photo albums. Then I found a locked wooden box. It wasn't particularly ornate, just a rectangular container the size of a bread box, secured with a simple brass lock. The key was taped to the bottom, along with a yellowed note that read, "Some truths should stay buried. But if you found this, perhaps it's time someone remembered." Inside, I found a leather-bound journal, a folded map, and a small cloth bag containing a piece of a street sign, a corner with only the letter M visible. The journal belonged to my great-grandfather, Thomas Harper, a man I knew little about other than his profession as a civil engineer. The first entry was dated April 3rd, 1923. I've accepted the commission from the Millbrook Development Corporation. The pay is extraordinary enough to set Eleanor and the children up comfortably for years, Mr. Mays. Whitaker was most insistent that I begin immediately. The town was to be built from the ground up according to an incredibly specific blueprint. Flipping through the pages, I discovered that Thomas had been hired to design and oversee the construction of Millbrook, a planned community in western Massachusetts. What caught my attention was the bizarrely precise nature of the requirements, especially regarding the street layout. May 17th, 1923. The street plan continues to confound me. Mr. Whitaker insists that the roads follow these precise angles and intersections. When I suggested a more efficient grid pattern, he became quite agitated. The design is not arbitrary, he said. The pattern must be maintained exactly as specified. As the months passed, Thomas's entries grew more detailed and increasingly concerned. The investors behind the Millbrook Development Corporation were elusive, rarely visiting the site, but sending unyielding instructions. The names of the streets were especially peculiar. July 8th, 1923. The naming convention for the streets is odd. Mr. Whitaker provided a list of names to be used in a specific order, radiating outward from the town center. They don't make sense. Machan Avenue, Dararith Street, Chambers Road. When I asked about their meaning, Whitaker just said they were benefactors of the project. I unfolded the map stored with the journal. It displayed a street plan of Millbrook, each road meticulously labeled. But it wasn't a typical grid. It looked more like a symbol or pattern, almost organic when viewed from above. The streets radiated from a central plaza with sharp angles and curves that seemed purposeless. I returned to the journal. October 30th, 1923. Construction proceeds ahead of schedule. The workers are well paid and efficient, though some have commented on the unusual design. Yesterday, I overheard two of them discussing the layout. "It's like a giant symbol," one said. "Please give me a like and subscribe so I can be motivated to create more great videos." My grandfather would recognize it. He had books about this sort of thing. The entries continued through 1924, with houses, shops, and residents gradually filling Millbrook. However, the Millbrook Development Corporation maintained a strict vetting process for property owners, and many of the first residents had strange ties to the shadowy investors. February 14th, 1925. Eleanor is concerned about my obsession with the Millbrook project. I've tried to explain that something about the town's design disturbs me, but I can't put my finger on it. Last night I dreamt I was standing in the central plaza, staring at the street signs, and all the names began to bleed. The letters dripped like crimson paint. I woke up in a cold sweat. The deeper I read, the more disturbed Thomas seemed. He'd finished the first phase of construction, but remained as the town's engineer overseeing maintenance and expansion. He'd even moved his family to a house on the outskirts of Millbrook. September 5th, 1927. I've been mapping the ley lines as suggested by a book from Miskatonic University. There's no denying it anymore. The street layout aligns perfectly. This town wasn't built for people. It's a gate or maybe a lock. The entries grew more sporadic after that. Thomas mentioned odd happenings, strange gatherings in the central plaza on specific dates, residents who seemed to disappear during the day, and the way fog lingered in certain intersections, no matter the weather. Then came the entry that froze my blood. March 22nd, 1931. I confronted Whitaker today with what I've discovered. The street names aren't random. They come from the ascendant texts. Each one marks a boundary between our world and something else. He didn't deny it. He just smiled and said, "You've come farther than we expected, Harper. Perhaps there's a place for you in the inner circle after all." I couldn't take it. I had to protect Eleanor and little Margaret. We would leave that night. But they didn't leave. The next entry, 2 weeks later, April 7th, 1931. They're watching the house. Men in dark coats stand on the corner day and night. Eleanor saw one of them peering through our kitchen window yesterday. Margaret came home from school in tears, saying her teacher warned her that children who try to leave Millbrook are taken by the Hollow Man. The next entry didn't come until nearly a year later, February 18th, 1932. We've settled in Boston. I've taken a job with a construction firm under a new name. Still, I wake up screaming some nights. Eleanor pretends not to notice the symbols I compulsively draw and destroy. Margaret asks when we're going home. God help me. But sometimes, despite everything, I feel drawn back toward Millbrook like a compass pulled by an invisible force. The journal entries became fewer and more desperate, with Thomas noting eerie occurrences. Familiar faces from Millbrook appearing in Boston, strange newspaper reports about missing people and weather patterns mimicking those in the town. Then came the frantic final entry, October 31st, 1937. They've found us. A letter arrived today, addressed to my real name, though we've been living as the Clarks for 5 years now. Inside was a piece of a street sign, a fragment of Derleth Street, and a note. The pattern is weakening. Your expertise is required. I burned the note, but I can't bring myself to destroy the sign. Something stops me. The pull toward Millbrook grows stronger. The entries after that chronicled Thomas's gradual descent into either madness or a horrifying clarity, depending on how you choose to interpret them. He described dreams where he wandered the streets of Millbrook at night, with the buildings towering impossibly high above him, the street signs glowing with an eerie inner light. May 4th, 1938. I've started corresponding with others who escaped Millbrook. There aren't many of us. A shopkeeper named Daniels, a teacher called Miss Winters, and Dr. Finch, who ran the town's only medical practice until 1932. They all feel it too. The pull, the dreams, the sense that something is coming to fruition in that cursed place. Thomas and his fellow refugees, as he called them, exchanged information, piecing together the town's dark purpose. According to his increasingly disturbing entries, Millbrook had been constructed as some sort of antenna or focusing device. The specific street layout, when viewed from above, formed a complex symbol, one designed to weaken the barriers between dimensions. September 15, 1939. The signs are unmistakable. War has begun in Europe. The old texts were clear. When the world is bathed in blood again, the door will be ready to open. Millbrook was always meant for this moment. The street names are keys, each one named for a guardian that must be appeased before the final gate can open. As the war in Europe escalated, Thomas's entries became more frantic. He wrote about returning to Millbrook in secret, observing from the woods as strange rituals took place in the town square. The residents, many of them original settlers, moved through the streets in predetermined patterns on certain nights. June 18, 1941. America will enter the war soon. Everyone can feel it coming. And when that happens, when American blood joins the flow, the conditions will be perfect. Miss Winters infiltrated a gathering at the old Whitaker mansion. They're planning something for midsummer 1942, the final alignment they called it. We cannot allow it to proceed. The next few entries detailed an audacious plan. Thomas and his fellow escapees had deduced that the street names were part of the town's power. Each was a word of power from some forgotten language disguised as innocent surnames. If the names could be altered or removed, they hoped to disrupt the ritual the founders had planned. December 8, 1941. Pearl Harbor has been attacked. America is at war. We have no more time. The plan must be executed before the solstice. The following entries chronicled their desperate sabotage. Under the cover of night, Thomas and 5 others sneaked into Millbrook armed with tools and acid. They defaced and removed street signs, replacing them with altered names, hoping to disrupt the pattern that had been so carefully constructed. January 3, 1942. We succeeded in altering or removing 17 of the 23 crucial signposts. Daniels was captured on Machan Avenue. I heard his screams as I fled into the woods. Miss Winters and I barely escaped when a patrol discovered us on Chambers Road. The acid burned through my gloves. The scars will never heal, I fear. The final entries grew more paranoid and incoherent. Thomas wrote about being pursued across Massachusetts, about shadows that moved independently and whispers in the walls of their rented rooms. The last full entry was dated May 30th, 1942. They're closing in. Dr. Finch took his own life yesterday, rather than be captured. Miss Winters has disappeared. I'm leaving this record and the map with Margaret for safekeeping before I make my final journey. I return to Millbrook tonight to finish what we started. The summer solstice approaches, and they will try to replace the signs before then. I cannot allow it. If I do not return, know that I died attempting to close a door that should never have been opened. That was the last entry in the journal. My grandmother, Margaret, would have been around 20 years old then. She never spoke of her father, except to say he had died during the war, which I'd always assumed meant he had been a soldier. I sat in that dusty attic for a long time, the journal in my lap, wondering if my great-grandfather had lost his mind, or if something genuinely sinister had happened in that town called Millbrook. The rational part of me insisted this was either delusion or a well-crafted fiction. But the other part, the part that shivers when the wind howls at night, wasn't so sure. Curiosity won out. I searched online for any mention of Millbrook, Massachusetts. There was nothing except for a few towns with similar names elsewhere. I expanded my search to historical records and found a single reference in a 1943 Regional Gazette. The previously scheduled incorporation of Millbrook Township has been indefinitely postponed due to irregularities in the municipal boundary survey. That was it. A town that had existed for nearly 20 years had simply vanished from record. I couldn't let it go. I spent another week wrapping up my grandmother's affairs, then packed my car for what I told myself would be a brief investigative trip. I had the map from Thomas's box faded and yellowed, but still legible. If Millbrook had existed, I could find it. The drive took me through the western part of Massachusetts into increasingly rural areas, navigating winding country roads bordered by dense forests. According to my great-grandfather's map, Millbrook should have been nestled in a small valley between two modest mountains. As I crested a hill, my GPS lost signal typical for such remote areas. I kept going following the map until I reached what should have been the town's outskirts. There was nothing there but forest and a single rutted dirt road leading into the trees. I almost turned back then, but I had come too far to quit. I parked at the road's entrance and continued on foot, map in hand, comparing the land's contours with what was drawn on paper. After about 20 minutes, the trees began to thin, and I found myself at the edge of a large clearing far too regular and geometrically precise to be natural. In the center of the clearing were the unmistakable remnants of a small town. Most buildings had been reduced to foundations, with nature reclaiming the land. Saplings grew through what had once been living rooms, and vines crawled over crumbling stone walls, but the street grid was still visible. Narrow paths of packed earth marked where roads once ran, just wide enough to walk single file between encroaching vegetation. I checked my map. I was standing where Derlith Street should have started. Looking down, I noticed something half buried in the soil, a rusted piece of metal. I knelt and brushed away the dirt. It was a street sign mounting bracket torn from its post. My heart raced as I followed the ghost streets deeper into the remains of Millbrook. Here and there I found evidence of hasty destruction. A stone fountain in what must have been the central plaza was cracked and dry. The charred skeleton of a large municipal building and a church with its steeple collapsed onto its roof. But the most unsettling discovery came when I reached what the map labeled as Whitaker Mansion on the town's northern side. Unlike most other buildings, large portions of this one remained intact stone walls, blackened by fire, but still standing a partial second story with empty window frames like hollow eyes. I hesitated at the entrance, suddenly acutely aware of how utterly alone I was. No one knew where I had gone. Cell service had disappeared miles ago. If something happened to me here, it might be weeks before anyone found me. But I had come too far to turn back. I stepped through the doorless entrance into what had once been a grand foyer. The floor was littered with debris, rotted furniture, fallen ceiling plaster, and animal droppings. But against the far wall stood a bookcase, somehow surviving both fire and the elements. Most of the volumes were ruined, their pages fused into solid bricks of moldy paper. But one book caught my eye, its leather binding still relatively intact, protected by its position in a recessed corner. I carefully worked it free and opened it. It was a ledger containing what appeared to be minutes of meetings held by something called the Millbrook Convergence Society. The entries dated from 1923 to 1942, documenting discussions among the town's founders and leaders. Many names were familiar from Thomas's journal. Whitaker featured prominently along with others he'd mentioned. I flipped through the brittle pages, scanning entries. Most of them were mundane discussions of town business, but interspersed were cryptic references to the pattern, the approaching alignment, and the thinning. Then I found an entry dated June 22nd, 1942, after Thomas's final journal entry. Emergency session called to address the crisis. Street markers in 17 critical nodes have been destroyed or defaced by Harper and his accomplices. Harper himself was captured attempting to sabotage the central convergence point and has been dealt with accordingly. However, the damage is extensive. The alignment occurs tonight, and there is insufficient time to reconstruct the failed nodes. After extensive debate, the Society has voted 7-2 to proceed with the calling despite the compromised pattern. Whitaker assures us that while the result may not be precisely what was originally intended, the fundamental thinning will still occur. All residents are instructed to proceed to their designated positions by midnight. The final entry was dated June 23, 1942, written in a shaky, hurried hand. The pattern failed. The thinning occurred but was not properly directed. The entity emerged partially but could not fully manifest due to the damaged street alignment. Those closest to the central convergence were... I cannot describe what happened to them. Those of us who survived vote unanimously to abandon Millbrook immediately. The damaged pattern has created an unstable convergence point that cannot be repaired. Government authorities will be told there was a fire. No records of Millbrook shall be preserved. May God forgive us for what we attempted. I closed the ledger, my hands trembling. Whatever these people had been attempting, my great-grandfather had disrupted it, possibly at the cost of his life. Looking around the ruined mansion with new eyes, I wondered exactly what had happened here on that midsummer night in 1942. A sound outside snapped me back to the present, a cracking twig like someone stepping on a branch. I froze, listening. It could have been an animal, but then I heard it again, closer to the mansion, followed by what sounded like a whispered conversation. I wasn't alone in the ruins of Millbrook. Moving as quietly as possible, I slipped the ledger into my backpack and crept toward one of the side windows. Peering through the empty frame, I saw 3 figures moving methodically through the overgrown plaza. They were dressed in ordinary hiking clothes, but something about their movements seemed off, too coordinated, too purposeful for casual explorers. One of them was holding what looked like a surveying instrument, taking measurements between specific points in the former town center. Another consulted a map that looked disturbingly similar to the one I'd found in my grandmother's attic. The third was hammering small metal markers into the ground at specific intervals. I ducked back inside as one of them looked toward the mansion. Had they seen me, I needed to leave immediately. There was another exit at the rear of the building, partially collapsed, but passable. I made my way through the ruined house as silently as possible, wincing at every creak of the floorboards. Just as I reached the back door, I heard voices inside the mansion. They'd followed me in. I slipped outside and crouched behind a crumbled wall, heart pounding. "Someone's been here recently," a man's voice said from inside. "Footprints in the dust, and the Whitaker ledger is missing." "Could be urban explorers," another voice replied. "This place shows up on some obscure forums." "No," the first voice said firmly. "Look at this. Someone's been comparing the site to an original map. See these depressions in the dust square, like a folded paper was opened here." "Shall I call it in?" asked a third voice, a woman's. "Yes. Tell them we may have a Harper situation. We need to accelerate the timetable, a Harper situation." They knew my name, or at least my great-grandfather's name. This wasn't a coincidence. These people were connected to whatever had happened here in 1942, and they were back for some purpose. I didn't wait to hear more. Staying low, I moved from one piece of cover to another, making my way toward the edge of the clearing. Once among the trees, I broke into a run, following the path back toward my car. I was almost there when I heard a shout behind me. They'd spotted me. I ran faster, branches whipping my face roots, threatening to trip me with every step. I burst out of the forest onto the road where I'd parked, fumbling for my keys as I ran to my car. The engine started on the first try, a small mercy, and I peeled away, gravel spraying behind me. In my rearview mirror, I saw 2 of the figures emerge from the trees, watching me drive away. They didn't chase or try to stop me. They simply stood there, observing, as if noting my appearance or my license plate. I drove without stopping until I reached the nearest town, with cell service constantly checking my mirror for pursuers. None appeared. At a small diner, I connected to the Wi-Fi and did something that, in retrospect, may have been incredibly foolish. I uploaded scans of Thomas's journal and the Whitaker ledger to the cloud storage account. Whatever was happening, I wanted evidence to exist somewhere. That night in a motel room with the chain secured and a chair propped under the doorknob, I reviewed everything I'd learned. My great-grandfather had helped build a town that was designed as some kind of mystical mechanism. The street layout formed a pattern meant to thin the barriers between dimensions. And when the pattern was disrupted by removing the street names, something had gone wrong with their ritual. Something catastrophic enough to make them abandon the town entirely. And now, more than 80 years later, someone was surveying the ruins, placing markers, preparing for something. I barely slept that night. Every sound in the old motel made me start awake, convinced that the people from Millbrook had found me. By morning, I was exhausted, but determined to get as far away as possible. I checked out at dawn and headed east, back toward Boston. It was on that drive that I made a connection I should have seen earlier. Thomas's journal had mentioned the ascendant texts as the source of the street names. On a hunch, I pulled over and searched the term online. The results were sparse but chilling. The ascendant texts were supposedly a collection of pre-medieval manuscripts describing rituals to contact or summon entities from beyond our reality. Most academic sources dismiss them as fictional references in obscure literature rather than actual documents. But a few fringe websites claimed the texts had existed and had been collected and suppressed by various governments over the centuries. One site in particular caught my attention. It claimed that in the early 20th century, a group called the Convergence Society had attempted to translate and implement rituals from the ascendant texts. The site was amateurish and filled with unsubstantiated claims, but one detail made my blood run cold. It alleged that the society had built a town in New England designed to focus dimensional energies. I closed the browser and got back on the road, my mind racing. If even half of what I discovered was true, someone had attempted to repeat what happened in Millbrook. Surveying the markers, they were trying to reconstruct the pattern. When I reached Boston, I went straight to the public library's historical archives. If Millbrook had ever officially existed, there should be some record tax documents, census data, something. I spent hours searching through microfiche and digitized archives. I found almost nothing, just as my online searches had suggested. But in a 1940 state infrastructure report, there was a single reference to road improvements planned for the Millbrook Township area, with a footnote indicating the project had been canceled. And in a local newspaper from 1942, a small item mentioned a severe fire in the Western Forest region that had destroyed an unincorporated settlement. No name was given. It was as if Millbrook had been systematically erased from record, exactly as the final ledger entry had promised. As I left the library, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Across the street, a dark sedan was parked, and I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat watching the library entrance. I turned abruptly and walked in the opposite direction, taking random turns through Boston's winding streets until I was confident I'd lost any potential tail. That evening, I checked into a different hotel under a false name, paying cash. In my room, I spread out all my notes and findings, trying to determine my next move. The rational part of me said to walk away, burn the journal, forget I'd ever heard of Millbrook, and get back to my normal life. But I couldn't. Not just because of curiosity, though. That was certainly a factor. I felt a responsibility to my great-grandfather, who had sacrificed himself to stop whatever the Convergence Society had planned, and possibly to prevent it from happening again. I decided to seek out experts who might shed light on what I'd found without thinking I was completely delusional. The next day, I visited an architectural historian at MIT who specialized in planned communities of the early 20th century. I showed her the map of Millbrook without explaining its full significance. She studied it with interest. "This is unusual," she said. Planned towns from this era typically used grid patterns for efficiency. This organic layout would have been extremely costly to implement. She pointed to the strange angles and curves. There's almost a mathematical precision to the irregularity, if that makes sense. like it was designed according to some formula rather than practical considerations. Have you ever seen anything like it? Actually, yes, she replied, pulling a book from her shelf. There were a handful of experimental communities built in the 1920s based on theosophical principles. The idea that certain geometric arrangements could enhance spiritual energies. She opened the book to a page showing a commune built in upstate New York in 1919. The street pattern had similarities to Millbrook, though less complex. The founders believed that proper alignment with celestial bodies and earth energies could create a harmony conducive to enlightenment, she explained. Most of these communities failed within a few years. Was this town actually built? I asked cautiously. Partially, I said. It didn't last long. She nodded. That tracks with the historical record. The Depression wiped out many experimental communities. Interesting find, though. Where did you get this family papers? I nodded. My great-grandfather was an engineer. After leaving the historian, I felt both validated and more disturbed. If other communities had been built on similar principles, but with less sophistication, what made Millbrook different? What had the Convergent Society understood that others hadn't? My next stop was less conventional. Through some online research, I found a professor of comparative mythology who had written papers on occult geometry and architectural symbolism. His university webpage showed a spectacled, serious-looking man. But his office told a different story, walls lined with artifacts from various cultures' shelves, overflowing with obscure texts, and a large drawing board covered with complex geometric designs. Dr. Elliot listened patiently as I told him a carefully edited version of my discovery that I'd found my great-grandfather's journal describing a strangely designed town and was curious about its possible significance. I showed him the map, but not the journal itself. Unlike the architectural historian, Dr. Elliot's reaction was immediate and visceral. He stared at the map for several long moments, then abruptly stood and locked his office door. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight. "My great-grandfather," I began, but he interrupted. "No. I mean, who gave you this map? Who put you up to this?" "Nobody," I insisted. "I found it among family papers. My great-grandfather helped design this town in the 1920s. Dr. Elliot studied my face, apparently searching for signs of deception. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because he sat back down, though he remained tense. "Mr. Harper," he said slowly, "this map depicts what occultists would call a summoning circuit." He leaned forward, pointing to the central plaza. "In certain traditions, it's believed that specific geometric patterns can serve as conduits for entities that exist outside our normal reality. This particular design is sophisticated, dangerously so." He traced the pattern of streets with his finger. They're arranged in a modified Fibonacci sequence that creates what's called a thinning effect in the dimensional barrier. "You're saying this town was designed to contact something from another dimension?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not just contact," Dr. Elliot said grimly. "Summon, bring through, create a permanent doorway." He leaned in, eyes intense. "Mr. Harper, I've studied theoretical occult architecture for 20 years. I've never seen a design this complete, this purpose-built. Most historical attempts at such patterns were compromised by practical considerations or limited knowledge. This," he tapped the map, "this is the real thing." "How can you be so sure?" I asked. Dr. Elliot opened a drawer and removed a worn book bound in faded red leather. "Because I've seen fragments of this pattern before." He opened the book to a marked page and turned it toward me. There, among densely printed text in what looked like Latin, was a diagram showing elements of the Millbrook street plan. Not the complete layout, but portions of it labeled with symbols I didn't recognize. "This is from a 17th century treatise on dimensional thresholds," Dr. Elliot explained. The author claimed to have found these designs in a much older text. According to his notes, a complete implementation of this pattern would create a permanent aperture between realities. And you believe that's possible? I asked, skeptically. Dr. Elliot smiled thinly. What I believe isn't relevant. What matters is what the creators of Millbrook believed, and the lengths they went to in attempting to realize this design. He closed the book and looked at me. You said your great-grandfather helped design this town. Do you know what became of it? I hesitated, then decided to trust him with more of the story. I told him about Thomas's sabotage of the street signs and the apparent catastrophe that followed, though I left out my recent visit to the ruins and the people I'd seen there. Dr. Elliot listened with growing concern. When I finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Your great-grandfather may have saved countless lives, he said finally. If this ritual had proceeded as planned, well, the texts describe the consequences in apocalyptic terms, but something still happened, I pointed out. The ledger said the entity emerged partially. What could that mean? Nothing good, Dr. Elliot said grimly. These rituals aren't like turning on a light switch. They're more like opening a floodgate. If the process was started but interrupted, it could have created an unstable situation, a partial thinning that neither fully manifested nor fully closed. Like a wound that never properly healed, I suggested. Exactly, he nodded. And wounds can be reopened. We talked for another hour with Dr. Elliot, explaining more about the theoretical underpinnings of what the Convergence Society had attempted. Much of it went over my head. Quantum entanglement theories blended with ancient mystical concepts in ways I couldn't fully grasp. But one thing became abundantly clear. What had happened in Millbrook was potentially dangerous. And if someone was trying to reconstruct the pattern, they needed to be stopped. As I was leaving, Dr. Elliot grabbed my arm. Mr. Harper, be careful. The kind of people who pursue this knowledge don't take kindly to interference. Your great-grandfather learned that the hard way. I will, I promised. That night, back in my hotel room, I made a decision. I needed to return to Millbrook, not to the ruins themselves, which were likely being watched, but to the county records office nearest to where the town had been. If the Convergence Society was trying to rebuild, they might have filed permits or purchased land. There might be a paper trail. The county courthouse was a 3-hour drive from Boston. I arrived when it opened and spent the morning searching property records for the area surrounding the former location of Millbrook. Most of the land was state forest, but I found something interesting. In the past year, several parcels adjacent to the Millbrook site had been purchased by a corporation called New Convergence Development LLC. The company had filed permits for historical research and land surveying, but nothing for construction yet. The contact person listed was a Dr. Alan Whitaker. Whitaker, the same surname as the man who had hired my great-grandfather a century earlier. I dug deeper and found that New Convergence Development had been incorporated just 18 months earlier. Its business filing listed a Boston address. On a hunch, I checked ownership records for that address and found it belonged to something called the Ascendant Heritage Foundation, a name that eerily echoed the Ascendant texts mentioned in Thomas's journal. I was onto something. These people weren't hiding, not completely. They were operating in the open, behind a veneer of corporate legitimacy. That meant they could be tracked, monitored, and perhaps even stopped through legal channels. But first, I needed proof of what they were planning, something more concrete than century-old journals and ledgers that mentioned mystical convergences and dimensional entities. I needed to document what was happening at the Millbrook site. Now I left the courthouse with copies of everything I'd found and drove to a camping supply store. If I was going back to Millbrook, I wouldn't approach from the same direction and I'd be better prepared. I purchased a high-quality camera with a telephoto lens, a digital voice recorder, a compass, infrared binoculars for night observation, and basic camping gear. My plan was to hike in from the north, where the state forest was densest, and set up a hidden observation post overlooking the ruins. I'd document whatever activities were taking place, and then take the evidence to... Well, I wasn't sure who would believe me. Perhaps Perhaps Dr. Elliot could help with that. I spent that night in a small motel about 20 miles from the Millbrook site, reviewing maps of the state forest and planning my approach. According to online satellite imagery, there was a fire watch tower about 2 miles north of where Millbrook had been. If I could reach it, it would provide an excellent vantage point. Just before dawn, I parked at a trailhead several miles from my destination and began hiking through the forest. The morning was misty, the ground still wet with dew. I moved carefully, conscious of making noise or leaving an obvious trail. It took me nearly 3 hours to reach the vicinity of the fire tower. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The tower, which should have been abandoned according to the Forestry Department website, showed signs of recent use. The lower stairs, which would normally be raised to prevent unauthorized access, were down. Fresh boot prints marked the ground around the base. I hesitated, then decided to continue. If someone was using the tower, they were likely gone during the early morning hours. I ascended the metal stairs as quietly as possible, wincing at every creak and groan of the aged structure. The observation platform at the top was empty, but signs of occupation were evident. A camp stove sleeping bag and what looked like monitoring equipment. A pair of high-powered binoculars was mounted on a tripod, aimed directly at the clearing where Millbrook had stood. I set up my camera and peered through the lens. With the telephoto, I could clearly see the ruins and the activity taking place there. At least a dozen people moved through the former streets, following the original paths. They had cleared away much of the vegetation, revealing the foundations of buildings and the ghostly grid of the town. In the central plaza where Thomas's map had shown the convergence point, they had erected a temporary structure, an intriguing geodesic dome covering whatever work was happening at the most crucial juncture of the pattern around the perimeter of the clearing. Others were placing what looked like metal poles at regular intervals, recreating the street grid in 3 dimensions. I took dozens of photographs, documenting everything I could see. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Along one of the restored streets, they were installing actual street signs, exact replicas of the ones Thomas and his allies had destroyed in 1942. I zoomed in with my camera and could make out the name on one, Mashian Avenue. They weren't just surveying or researching. They were rebuilding Millbrook exactly as it had been, street names and all. I was so focused on documenting what I was seeing that I almost missed the sound of footsteps on the metal stairs below me. Someone was ascending the tower. I had seconds to react. There was nowhere to hide on the small platform. The only option was to confront whoever was coming, or I could look over the railing. The tower had a maintenance ladder on the opposite side from the stairs, narrow metal rungs descending vertically down the framework. Without giving myself time to reconsider, I swung over the railing and onto the ladder just as a man reached the top of the stairs. Clinging to the outside of the tower, I held perfectly still, hoping he wouldn't notice the movement of the structure or peer over the edge. I could hear him moving around the platform, could hear the rustling of papers and the click of equipment being adjusted. Central point to observation post. Status report, a voice crackled from what sounded like a radio. All clear, the man on the platform replied. No activity on the north approach. The preparation team reports they'll complete the 3rd quadrant by nightfall. Any sign of our visitor from yesterday? Negative. Local police are monitoring his vehicle description, but no sightings reported. Assessment team believes he's a Harper descendant. The resemblance was noted. Keep observation protocols active. Convergence is scheduled in 3 days. We can't risk another interference. The conversation continued, but a gust of wind made it hard to hear. I clung to the ladder, my arms beginning to ache from the awkward position. I needed to get down and away before I was discovered, but the slightest movement might alert the observer. Finally, I heard what sounded like the man settling into a chair. Taking a chance, I began to descend 1 rung at a time, moving as slowly and smoothly as possible to minimize the vibration of the tower. It took nearly 20 minutes to reach the ground, my muscles screaming in protest. Once there, I didn't dare look back. I moved directly into the densest part of the forest, putting as much distance between myself and the tower as I could before stopping to catch my breath. They were planning some kind of convergence in 3 days. Whatever ritual had failed in 1942, they were attempting to recreate it, and they were almost ready. I needed to get back to civilization and figure out how to stop them. I hiked for hours, circling wide around the Millbrook clearing, constantly watching for patrols or observers. By late afternoon, I reached my car without incident and drove straight back toward Boston, checking regularly to ensure I wasn't being followed. That evening, I reviewed the photos I had taken. They clearly showed the reconstruction effort, the street grid being reestablished, the signs being installed, the dome at the convergence point. It was happening just as I'd feared. I called Dr. Elliott and arranged to meet him the following morning. If anyone would know what to do with this information, it would be him. I encrypted the photos and sent them to his university email as a precaution, along with scans of everything I'd found in the county records. That night, exhausted, but too wired to sleep, I returned to Thomas's journal, reading it more carefully, looking for anything that might help prevent what was coming. There had to be a reason his sabotage had worked, some vulnerability in the ritual that could be exploited again. One passage caught my attention from October 1929. The street names are more than mere labels. They're anchors for the energies being channeled. Each name corresponds to a specific frequency or vibration. Whitaker once let slip that the names must be rendered in a particular material and placed at precise coordinates. Deviation of even a few feet would disrupt the harmonics of the entire system. And later, from May 1941. Miss Winters has discovered something crucial. The street signs aren't merely metal. They contain a specific alloy, including what Whitaker called material from beyond. Each sign was forged individually according to precise specifications. They cannot be replaced with ordinary signs. This is why they guard them so carefully. That was why Thomas and his allies had targeted the signs. They were irreplaceable components of the ritual mechanism, containing some exotic material that couldn't be easily substituted. But the people rebuilding Millbrook had obviously solved that problem, creating new signs that would serve the same function. Unless, what if they hadn't replaced all of them? What if they were missing some critical piece? I thought of the fragment Thomas had kept. The corner of a sign with the partial letter visible. I'd assumed it was a memento, a piece of evidence he'd held on to. But what if it was more than that? What if he'd kept it specifically because it was irreplaceable? The piece had been in the wooden box with the journal. I'd left it at my grandmother's house, not recognizing its significance. If I was right, that fragment might be the key to disrupting their plans once again. I called a neighbor who had agreed to check on the house while I was away and asked her to look for the small cloth bag in the attic. To my relief, she found it quickly and agreed to overnight it to my hotel in Boston. The next morning, I met Dr. Elliott at a small cafe near the MIT campus. He looked haggard with dark circles under his eyes, suggesting he'd slept as poorly as I had. "I've been reviewing everything you sent," he said without preamble. "It's worse than I thought. The configuration they're building isn't just similar to the theoretical models. It's an exact match to what's described in the Kitab Allahs." The what I asked. An ancient text supposedly written by a mad Arab scholar. Most copies were destroyed centuries ago, but fragments survive. It describes a method for creating what it calls thin places locations, where the barrier between dimensions can be breached. "And you think that's what they're doing in Millbrook?" "I'm certain of it," he said, pushing a folder across the table. "I've compiled everything I could find on similar rituals from various traditions. The timing is significant. They're planning this for the summer solstice, when certain astronomical alignments would theoretically enhance the effect." "The man at the tower said convergence is scheduled in 3 days," I told him. "That matches the solstice." Dr. Elliott nodded grimly. "We need to stop them." "How go to the police?" "The FBI who would believe us, not the authorities," he said. They'd never understand in time, and the Ascendant Heritage Foundation has too many connections. Money opens doors, and these people have been planning this for generations. He leaned forward. We need to disrupt the pattern directly, just as your great-grandfather did. I think I may have a way, I said, and told him about the sign fragment and my theory about the exotic material. Dr. Elliott's eyes widened. If you're right, that could be crucial. The texts are specific about the materials used in these rituals. They must contain elements that have been exposed to the other side, creating a sympathetic connection. So if we return to Millbrook with this fragment, we might be able to disrupt whatever they're planning, he finished. But it would be dangerous. These people killed your great-grandfather for his interference. They wouldn't hesitate to do the same to us. What choice do we have? I asked. If what you're saying is true, if they succeed, then something comes through, Dr. Elliott said quietly. Something that by all accounts should remain on the other side. We spent the rest of the day planning. The sign fragment would arrive the following morning. That would give us 2 days before the solstice time to return to Millbrook and find a way to sabotage the ritual. Dr. Elliott had more resources than I'd expected. Through contacts in the occult research community, he obtained detailed satellite imagery of the Millbrook site showing blind spots in what appeared to be a security perimeter. He also brought equipment I hadn't thought of, electromagnetic field detectors, which he said might help us locate the convergence point precisely, and small devices that emitted specific frequencies that could theoretically disrupt the harmonics of the ritual. I've been studying this phenomenon theoretically for years, he explained when I expressed surprise at his preparedness. I never thought I'd have a chance to prevent an actual attempt. The package from my grandmother's house arrived early the next morning. The sign fragment was exactly as I remembered, a small triangular piece of metal with part of the letter visible. It felt unusually heavy for its size, and when Dr. Elliott examined it with his equipment, the readings were off the charts. Extraordinary, he murmured. This material is unlike anything I've seen. The electromagnetic signature is... Well, it's not consistent with any known element. Will it be enough to disrupt their ritual? I asked. Theoretically, yes. If we can place it at the convergence point, it should create enough dissonance in the pattern to prevent completion. But getting close enough to do that. He trailed off, uncertainty creeping into his voice. We'll find a way, I said more confidently than I felt. We left Boston that afternoon in Dr. Elliott's SUV, taking a circuitous route to avoid main roads where we might be spotted. By nightfall, we had reached a small hunting cabin he had arranged for us to use about 5 miles from the Millbrook site. The plan was to approach just before dawn, when security would be lightest. Based on the satellite imagery, there was a drainage culvert on the eastern edge of the clearing that might allow us to get close to the central plaza without being detected. That night, as we made final preparations, Dr. Elliott showed me something he'd been working on. A small device that combined the sign fragment with what he called a nullification circuit. If we can't reach the convergence point directly, this might work from a distance, he explained. It amplifies the disruptive properties of the fragment and broadcasts them across a specific frequency range. Will it stop the ritual? I asked. I don't know, he admitted, but it's an additional option if our primary plan fails. We left the cabin at 3 a.m., dressed in dark clothing and carrying only what was essential. The nullification device, basic tools, water, and emergency supplies in case we needed to flee into the forest. The night was cloudy with no moon visible, perfect conditions for our approach. We hiked in silence, Dr. Elliott leading the way with a red-filtered flashlight that would be less visible to any watchers. As we neared the Millbrook perimeter, he activated one of his detection devices, which was supposed to alert us to any electronic security measures. The device remained silent as we located the drainage culvert, a concrete pipe about 3 feet in diameter that ran beneath what had once been the eastern edge of town. It was partially filled with stagnant water and debris, but passable. We crawled through, emerging in a depression that had once been someone's basement, now overgrown with ferns and moss. From there we could see the activity in the clearing. Despite the early hour, the site was alive with movement. Floodlights illuminated the central plaza, where the geodesic dome now glowed from within with a pulsing greenish light. Around the perimeter, figures moved with purpose, checking equipment and adjusting the metal poles I had seen earlier. "They're further along than I expected," Dr. Elliot whispered. "Look at the configuration of those poles. They're creating a three-dimensional version of the street pattern." "Can we still reach the convergence point?" I asked. He studied the scene, then pointed to a dark area between two of the floodlights. "There. If we time it right, we can move between those positions without being seen. But we'll need a distraction." From his pack, Dr. Elliot removed what looked like a small drone. "This will fly to the opposite side of the clearing and emit a high-frequency pulse that should temporarily disrupt their equipment. It won't give us long, maybe 30 seconds, but it might be enough." The plan was simple. When the distraction occurred, we would sprint across the open space to the dome. Dr. Elliot would use a small cutting tool to create an opening, and I would place the nullification device at the convergence point inside. We waited for a moment when the patrols were at their furthest points. Then Dr. Elliot launched the drone. It rose silently into the air, barely visible against the night sky, and flew toward the western edge of the clearing. "Ready," he whispered. "When you hear the pulse run directly for the dome, don't stop for anything." I nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. We crouched at the edge of our cover, muscles tense to sprint. The pulse came, a high, warbling sound that made my teeth ache. Immediately, confusion erupted among the workers. The floodlights flickered, and several people ran toward the source of the disturbance. Now Dr. Elliot hissed and we ran. The distance to the dome was perhaps 50 yards, but it felt like miles. I ran as I had never run before, expecting at any moment to hear a shout of discovery or feel the impact of a bullet. But we reached the dome without incident. Dr. Elliot was already working with his cutting tool on the synthetic fabric. "Hold this open," he ordered, creating a slit just large enough to slip through. I pulled the edges apart while he ducked inside, then followed. What I saw inside the dome defied easy description. The space seemed larger than it should have been, given the exterior dimensions. At the center was a circular platform of some dark stone, inscribed with symbols similar to those Dr. Elliot had shown me in the ancient text. Arranged around it were 9 metal poles, each bearing a street sign, Manderlith Chambers, and others I didn't recognize. But what drew my eye was what hung above the platform, a sphere of what looked like liquid darkness, about 3 feet in diameter, rotating slowly. It didn't reflect the greenish light that filled the rest of the dome. Rather, it seemed to absorb it. Looking at it made my eyes hurt and my thoughts scatter. "My God," Dr. Elliot breathed. "They've already initiated the thinning." "What is that thing?" I asked, unable to look away from the dark sphere. "A manifestation of the boundary itself," he replied quietly. "The membrane between realities made visible." He moved toward the platform, the nullification device in hand. "We need to place this at the exact center beneath the sphere." As he stepped onto the platform, a voice came from behind us. "I wouldn't do that, Doctor." We turned to find a man standing in the entrance we'd created. He was tall and thin, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to reflect the greenish light unnaturally. He wore a tailored suit that looked out of place in the forest setting. "Whitaker, I presume," Dr. Elliot said, not lowering the device. "Alan Whitaker." "Yes," the man confirmed with a slight smile. "And you would be Dr. James Elliot, whose papers on dimensional theory have been most helpful to our work. I should thank you for your unwitting contributions." His gaze shifted to me. "And Mr. Daniel Harper, your resemblance to your great-grandfather is remarkable. He was a brilliant engineer, though sadly misguided in his opposition to our work." "What you're doing is dangerous," I said. "You have no idea what might come through if you succeed." "On the contrary," Whitaker replied calmly, "we know exactly what we're calling. The entity has been waiting since 1942, when your great-grandfather's interference created an incomplete manifestation. It exists in a state of partial emergence, neither fully here nor fully there. We're simply completing what was started. The catastrophe in 1942 wasn't enough to convince you this is a bad idea, Dr. Elliot demanded. A setback, nothing more, Whitaker said with a dismissive wave. The price of progress. Those who died were honored for their sacrifice. As he spoke, I noticed the dark sphere pulsing, expanding slightly with each throb. The greenish light seemed to intensify, and I could feel a vibration through the soles of my feet as if the earth itself were humming. Now Whitaker continued. I'm afraid I must ask you to step away from the convergence point. Our window of opportunity approaches, and we cannot risk another disruption. Dr. Elliot glanced at me, then back at the sphere. In that moment, I knew what he was going to do. Before I could stop him, he lunged forward, thrusting the nullification device directly into the center of the dark sphere. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The sphere collapsed in on itself with a sound like reality tearing, then exploded outward in a wave of darkness that knocked us all off our feet. The dome's fabric rippled like water, and the metal poles bearing the street signs began to vibrate at a frequency that made my bones ache. Whitaker was screaming, though whether in rage or pain, I couldn't tell. The greenish light flickered wildly, then went out entirely, plunging us into darkness, broken only by sparks shooting from the now destroying nullification device. Run, Dr. Elliot shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the entrance. The reaction is destabilizing the entire pattern, he added, urgency in his voice. We stumbled out of the dome to find the clearing in chaos. The floodlights were failing, casting intermittent illumination over a scene of panic. The workers were fleeing in all directions as the metal poles around the perimeter began to topple like dominoes. A low subsonic rumble emanated from the ground itself. Dr. Elliot and I ran for the cover of the trees, not looking back until we'd reached the relative safety of the forest edge. When we turned, the dome was collapsing, its fabric torn by what looked like invisible claws from within. The dark sphere was visible through the rents, now pulsing erratically, throwing off arcs of energy that scarred the earth where they struck. Did we stop it? I gasped out of breath from our sprint. Not exactly, Dr. Elliot said grimly. We've destabilized the convergence, but the thinning had already begun. What we're seeing is a dimensional rupture, uncontrolled, unpredictable. Even as he spoke, the sphere seemed to be losing cohesion, stretching and distorting like a reflection in troubled water. The rumbling grew louder, and I could see fissures opening in the ground around the central plaza. We need to get as far away as possible, Dr. Elliot urged. When that rupture collapses, the energy release could be substantial. We turned and fled deeper into the forest, moving as quickly as we could through the undergrowth. Behind us, the sounds of destruction grew more intense. Cracking earth, the screech of metal under impossible stress, and a high, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We'd been running for perhaps 10 minutes when a concussive wave threw us forward onto the forest floor. A blast of hot air passed over us, bending the trees and stripping leaves from branches. Then silence, profound, almost unnatural quiet that seemed to absorb all other sounds. Slowly we picked ourselves up. Looking back toward Millbrook, we could see nothing but darkness. No floodlights, no glow from the dome. Nothing to suggest that minutes earlier, dozens of people had been working to thin the veil between worlds. Is it over? I asked, my voice sounding strange in the absolute silence. For now, Dr. Elliot said. The rupture has collapsed, whether that means the entity was pulled back entirely. He didn't finish the thought. We made our way back to the hunting cabin in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were inside with the door locked and the lights on that Dr. Elliot spoke again. The nullification device worked better than I could have hoped, he said, examining a burn on his hand from when he'd thrust it into the sphere. The fragment's properties, amplified by the circuit, created a dissonance that the pattern couldn't sustain. What about Whitaker and the others, I asked. I don't know, he admitted. Anyone too close to the convergence point when it collapsed? Well, dimensional physics in those conditions are unpredictable at best. He continued, his voice quiet. Will they try again? Dr. Elliot considered this. Perhaps. But we've destroyed their implementation and disrupted their timing. The solstice alignment won't recur for another year, and by then, we can ensure the site is being monitored. He gave me a tired smile. Your great-grandfather would be proud. We left the next morning, returning to Boston by a different route than we'd come. I half expected to see news reports of a strange explosion or incident in the western forest, but there was nothing. Just as there had been nothing in 1942, when Millbrook was abandoned the first time. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Elliot and I kept in touch, sharing information as we tracked the aftermath of what had happened. The Ascendant Heritage Foundation quietly dissolved its assets, transferred to various shell companies. The property around Millbrook was donated to the state as a nature preserve with stipulations that it remain undeveloped. Of Alan Whitaker and his team, there was no sign. No bodies were recovered. No missing persons reports filed. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist, erased as completely as the street names of Millbrook had been in 1942. I returned to my life, sorting through the remaining pieces of my grandmother's estate, including the rest of Thomas Harper's papers. Among them, I found a final item. I'd overlooked a letter addressed to my descendants, dated June 24th, 1942, the day after he'd made his last journal entry. It was brief, written in a shaky hand that barely resembled his earlier precise script. If you are reading this, then I have failed to return. Know that what we attempted was necessary. The pattern must never be completed. I go now to ensure the final disruption, to place the keystone fragment where it can never be recovered. If this burden falls to you someday, remember the names are the key. Without them, the streets are just paths, the town just buildings. With them, they become a circuit, a machine built for a terrible purpose. Keep watch. They will try again. And so I do keep watch. Dr. Elliot and I have established a monitoring system for the Millbrook site, remote sensors that alert us to any unusual activity. We've also begun tracking other potential convergence points around the world. Places where the geography and historical records suggest similar attempts might be made. But sometimes, in the dark hours of the night, I wonder, did we truly stop what was coming through, or merely delay it again? The entity that was partially manifested in 1942, where is it now? Does it wait in some liminal space between realities, growing stronger, more determined? And I wonder about the streets of Millbrook paths, in the forest, now slowly being reclaimed by nature. What power did those names hold? Those seemingly ordinary words that my great-grandfather gave his life to erase. What might they have summoned if spoken in the right sequence, at the right time, in the right place? Some questions, perhaps, are better left unanswered. Some names better left unspoken. Some towns better left unbuilt. My name is Daniel Harper, and I've told you a story about a place that tried to erase itself from memory. A town with streets that once had names. Names that were all erased by 1942. For good reason. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.